In a small, rural town surrounded by endless fields of corn, there was an old story that parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far at night. It was about a scarecrow tall, ragged, and weathered by decades of standing guard in the middle of a desolate cornfield. The story went that the scarecrow was no ordinary figure. It had been placed there by a farmer who mysteriously disappeared one stormy night, and since then, the scarecrow was said to have a mind of its own, watching over the fields with a sinister, almost human-like presence. For years, it was just a tale until one autumn night when a group of teenagers decided to test their bravery. The group Tom, Sarah, Greg, and Emily had heard the story 100 times but dismissed it as nothing more than small-town superstition. They dared each other to spend the night in the cornfield where the scarecrow stood, hoping to prove there was nothing to fear. Armed with flashlights and sleeping bags, they set out, joking and laughing as they made their way through the dense rows of corn. As they reached the center of the field, the scarecrow came into view. It was taller than they had imagined. Its head was made from a burlap sack, crudely stitched together with black thread. Its body was stuffed with hay, and its arms stretched out wide, nailed to a wooden post. Its eyes were hollow black pits, and its smile a twisted, unnatural grin seemed to follow them no matter where they stood. "Creepy, but harmless," Tom said, chuckling nervously. "Just an old scarecrow." They set up their camp around the scarecrow, laughing and telling ghost stories as the night grew darker. The wind rustled through the corn, creating an eerie whisper that surrounded them. But as the hours passed, the mood shifted. It started with Greg, who swore he saw the scarecrow's head move out of the corner of his eye. The others laughed it off, but soon Sarah felt it too, a strange sensation, like they were being watched. "Maybe it's just the wind," Emily said, her voice shaking slightly, but deep down, they all knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, Tom's flashlight flickered out. He cursed under his breath and banged it against his hand, but it didn't turn back on. Before anyone could react, Greg's light followed, then Sarah's. The field plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the moon. And that's when they heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the dry stalks of corn. At first, they thought it was just one of them, but as they glanced around, they realized everyone was accounted for except the scarecrow. "Okay, this isn't funny," Tom said, his voice cracking. "Who's messing with us?" But no one was laughing anymore. The footsteps grew louder, and as they turned toward the scarecrow, their blood ran cold. It had moved. The once stationary figure was now closer, its arms still outstretched, but its head tilted slightly, as if watching them. "No way," Sarah whispered, backing up. "That's impossible." Panicked, they scrambled to gather their things, but the maze of corn seemed to twist and turn in on itself. The more they tried to find their way out, the deeper they seemed to go. Every time they glanced back, the scarecrow was closer, its hollow eyes fixed on them, its grin stretching wider. The footsteps never stopped. One by one, the group started to fall behind. First Greg, who swore he felt something brush against him in the dark. He turned to look, and then he was gone, his scream swallowed by the thick walls of corn. Then Sarah, she ran ahead, but when they turned the corner, she was no longer there. Only the faint rustling of the corn remained, and the feeling of something unseen watching from just beyond their sight. By the time Tom and Emily reached the edge of the field, the scarecrow was mere feet behind them. Its arms, no longer outstretched, now hung by its sides, and its head had fully turned to face them. Its grin was impossibly wide, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight as if it had finally caught its prey. With one final burst of adrenaline, Tom and Emily ran desperate, terrified. They broke through the last row of corn, collapsing onto the dirt road that led back to town. Panting and shaking, they looked back. The scarecrow was gone. In the light of day, the cornfield looked ordinary again. There was no sign of Greg or Sarah, no trace of where they had gone. The scarecrow stood in its place, just as it had before, arms outstretched, grin plastered on its face, as if it had never moved. No one believed Tom and Emily's story. They were told their friends had likely gotten lost in the corn, that it was nothing but an accident. But the two survivors knew the truth. They had been watched. And somewhere deep in the corn, the scarecrow still waited, silent, patient, and hungry for more. Tom and Emily didn't speak much in the days that followed. They attended Greg and Sarah's memorial services, but the pit in their stomachs only grew deeper. The police had searched the cornfield extensively, but there was no sign of their friends. The official story was that Greg and Sarah got lost in the dense field and likely ran off or had some kind of accident. But Tom and Emily knew better. They hadn't gotten lost, they had been taken. Late one night, unable to sleep, Tom found himself staring out the window toward the dark stretch of land that led to the cornfield. The old scarecrow's figure still loomed in the distance, barely visible in the moonlight. Despite what had happened, he felt drawn to it, as if it were beckoning him back. The nightmares had started shortly after they escaped. Each night, Tom dreamed of the cornfield, of the scarecrow creeping closer and closer, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. He would wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something from that night had followed him home. One evening, Emily called. She sounded panicked, her voice trembling over the phone. "Tom, I've been seeing things," she whispered. "Everywhere I go, I see it. The scarecrow. It's like it's watching me." Tom's blood ran cold. "What do you mean you've seen it outside the field?" "I saw it this morning. In my backyard. And yesterday, I swear I saw it in the reflection of my bathroom mirror." Tom didn't know how to respond. The scarecrow was tied to the field, or at least, it was supposed to be. But Emily's voice was filled with fear, and deep down, Tom knew she wasn't imagining it. He had felt something similar, an unnerving sensation that lingered ever since that night. It was as if the scarecrow had latched onto them, refusing to let go. "We need to go back," Tom said suddenly, his voice shaking. "We need to end this." Emily was silent for a moment, but then she agreed. "We can't let it keep haunting us." That night, armed with flashlights and a sense of dread, Tom and Emily made their way back to the cornfield. The air was cold, and the wind seemed to whisper through the rows of corn, just as it had the night Greg and Sarah disappeared. The scarecrow stood in its usual spot, as motionless as ever. But something was different this time. As they got closer, they noticed that the scarecrow's grin was wider than before, its head tilted slightly as if it were amused by their return. And the air felt thicker, heavier. Every fiber of their being told them to turn back, but they had to know. They had to find out what had really happened to their friends. As they reached the base of the scarecrow's post, Emily gasped. There, buried beneath the stalks of corn, was something glinting in the moonlight. Tom bent down and unearthed it, his heart pounding in his chest. It was Sarah's necklace. "She was here," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is where they took her." The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. Whatever had taken their friends was tied to this field, to the scarecrow. Without thinking, Tom grabbed a nearby rock and swung it at the post holding the scarecrow up. The wood cracked, and the scarecrow fell forward, collapsing into a heap on the ground. For a moment, they felt a wave of relief. But then the ground beneath them shifted. The earth itself seemed to tremble as something moved beneath the soil. The rows of corn rustled violently, and the scarecrow's body began to twitch. Its head jerked upward, and to their horror, it began to rise this time, not on a post, but on its own two legs. "Run!" Tom screamed, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her away from the scarecrow as it lurched toward them, its movements stiff and unnatural, yet horrifyingly fast. They sprinted through the field, but no matter how fast they ran, the scarecrow seemed to follow, its hollow eyes glowing in the dark. The corn stalks slashed at their skin as they tore through the maze of rows, desperate to find the exit, but just like before, the field seemed endless. It twisted and turned, as if alive, trapping them inside. Just when they thought all hope was lost, they burst through the final row of corn and into the open. Gasping for breath, they collapsed onto the dirt road. But something was wrong. Tom looked around, his chest heaving, and his heart sank. They were standing in front of the farmhouse, the same one they had been running from. They hadn't escaped the field, they had run in circles. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she pointed to the edge of the field. The scarecrow was standing there, its head cocked to the side, as if studying them. It raised one long, bony arm and pointed directly at them. "What does it want?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Tom said, fear choking his voice. "But we need to get out of here. Now." They ran toward the farmhouse, slamming the door behind them. Inside, they locked every window, every door, trying to keep whatever was out there from getting in. But no matter how hard they tried to fortify the house, they couldn't escape the feeling that the scarecrow was watching them. Waiting. As the night wore on, the footsteps started again. Slow. Steady. Crunching through the gravel outside the house. Then came the tapping. Light, rhythmic taps against the window panes. First one, then another. The scarecrow was circling the house, testing the barriers they had put up, its presence pressing down on them like a weight they couldn't shake. "I can't do this," Emily cried, burying her face in her hands. "It's never going to stop, is it?" Tom didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the scarecrow had marked them. And no matter how far they ran or how many barriers they put up, the scarecrow would always find them. Because once it had its eyes on you, there was no escaping the scarecrow's watchful eye. The children of the corn. The farmhouse was everything they had dreamed of, a rustic retreat far from the bustling city, surrounded by fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a place of quiet, where the wind whispered through the endless cornfields and the nights were still and dark. The family, Tom, his wife Lisa, and their 7-year-old son, Jacob, settled in quickly, enchanted by the simple beauty of the land. Jacob, always a curious and adventurous child, took a particular interest in the cornfields. He would spend hours wandering between the towering stalks, playing games only he seemed to understand. When he returned from his explorations, he would eagerly share stories with his parents about his new friends, the children of the corn, he called them. Tom and Lisa found his stories endearing, if a little eerie, chalking it up to the vivid imagination of a young boy in a new place. But soon, Jacob's tales grew more unsettling. He described the children in vivid detail, their pale faces, the old-fashioned clothes they wore, their eyes that didn't seem to blink. He spoke of how they played hide and seek with him, calling to him from deeper within the corn, guiding him with whispers and laughter. Despite their son's growing obsession, Tom and Lisa dismissed his stories as mere fantasies, reminders of just how alone he was out here with no friends nearby. Then, the symbols appeared. One morning, Tom went out to inspect the field and found strange markings in the soil between the rows of corn. Intricate symbols, carefully etched in the earth, resembling ancient glyphs or runes. They were unfamiliar, strange, and seemed almost purposeful. The shapes twisted in ways that made Tom's stomach turn, though he couldn't explain why. At first, he thought it was just an odd prank, but as the symbols continued to appear day after day, their unease grew. Jacob's behavior changed, too. He became withdrawn, his once bright eyes dulled, and his voice softened to a whisper. He began to sleepwalk, wandering toward the cornfield at night, muttering words they couldn't understand. He rarely laughed or played anymore, and his parents felt helpless, watching as their lively little boy seemed to slip away into something darker. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob wandered out of the house without a word. By the time Tom and Lisa noticed his absence, he was already gone, lost among the endless rows of corn. Panic set in as they scrambled to find flashlights, their voices hoarse from calling his name. The cornfield at night was a different world, filled with shadows that seemed to twist and move, swallowing their voices. As they stumbled through the rows, Lisa thought she heard something, a faint giggle, like a child's laugh, just out of sight. "Jacob!" she cried, her voice trembling. "Jacob, come back!" But the only answer was more giggles, soft and chilling, followed by a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Come and play." Tom gripped her hand tightly, fear clawing at his heart as he realized the whispers were multiplying, weaving together in a strange harmony. It was then he understood, Jacob's friends, the children he spoke of, were not imaginary. They were here, hidden among the stalks, their presence as real and cold as the wind that whispered through the corn. A shape moved in the darkness, and Tom's flashlight caught a glimpse of a pale face, eyes staring unblinking before disappearing into the shadows. Another face appeared, then another, all watching them with eerie smiles. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, drowning out their frantic calls. Desperate, Tom and Lisa ran deeper into the corn, calling Jacob's name, but each row they passed seemed to twist back on itself, trapping them in a never-ending maze. The giggles echoed around them, closer now, and they could feel the eyes watching, always watching. And then they saw him, Jacob, standing just ahead, a blank expression on his face, as if he were in a trance. He didn't respond to their shouts, didn't blink or move, only stared back at them with vacant eyes. "Jacob, come here!" Lisa cried, reaching out to him. But as she stepped closer, the children emerged from the shadows, pale hands reaching for her, holding her back. Their touch was cold, their eyes empty and ancient, filled with something far older than innocence. Their whispers were a lullaby, a song from another time, pulling her into their cold embrace. Tom tried to pull her away, but the children surrounded them, their faces blurring into a sea of ghostly grins. The corn rustled, and the whispers became a chant, calling them deeper, welcoming them into the field that seemed to stretch endlessly. As the last light of day faded, the farmhouse stood silent against the horizon, the only sign of life the gentle sway of the corn in the breeze. And somewhere in the endless rows, a young boy's voice joined the whispers, laughing and calling, forever lost among the children of the corn.